everybody. Welcome back to the Underwater Photography Show. As always, I am Matthew Sullivan.
And I'm Alex Mustard.
And today we're going to do an episode addressing a comment we got on a previous video. So to get this going, I will read that comment and then we will get into it. So this comes from Greg Thomas 6400. He said, I came across this channel and have enjoyed going back and watching past episodes. Thank you, Greg. I have been a diver for a long time and an avid wildlife and landscape photographer. I am just now combining the two hobbies. I would love to see a short episode on autofocus. Are you primarily using AFS or AFC or handing off to 3D tracking? Are you using manual focus for macro? I'm wondering how much of my topside wildlife technique applies to underwater.
A simple question which lacks a simple answer. And the reason it lacks a simple answer, I can tell from Greg's email that he's a Nikon shooter because he was speaking in Nikon language. But first of all, autofocus is not one simple thing. So, the simple mechanism by which different cameras autofocus is different. Compact cameras, for example, typically use a contrast detection autofocus, which can be quite accurate, but is usually quite slow because actually the camera doesn't know which way it needs to move the lens to focus. Whereas the SLR cameras all pretty much use phase detection autofocus, and the top mirrorless cameras also use an even more advanced type of phase detection autofocus. But some of the lower mirrorless cameras use the contrast detection autofocus. So, and then all of those systems are electronic, and the more brain power and the more energy you have behind them, the better they will work. So you might have two cameras with what seem like very similar autofocus systems, but if one's got a much more powerful processor behind it, it'll run a lot faster. And when a autofocus system is more capable, some of the modes that will basically work for one camera brilliantly, that same mode, even on another camera from the same manufacturer, won't be the best option. So it is complicated. And it's complicated by the fact that the cameras do not all have the same type of autofocus. So you can't just say, use this one and it will work for everyone, from whether they're shooting with a TG6 or whether they're shooting with a Z9. Also, the different cameras have different options for autofocus, both in terms of how you activate that autofocus, how the camera runs its autofocus, and the different layouts of autofocus sensors across the screen. And all those things give you options. And it's further complicated by the fact that Olympus, Sony, Nikon, Canon, whoever else, they also have their own language for autofocus.
Yeah.
So all those factors make things pretty complicated, pretty murky. So I think the best thing that Matthew and I can do is to talk through the way that we set up our autofocuses and explain why we've ended up with those sensors, those options. All that said, you can simplify this whole argument down as to autofocus was put on cameras to make your life as a photographer easier, to give you spare capacity to not have to worry about focusing, and instead to be able to think about composition, about lighting, about the creativity you're bringing to the shot, what you're trying to say as a photographer with that shot. And as a result, if you're overthinking autofocus at the point of shooting, you're probably wasting your time. It's like, I'm trying to think of a good analogy. It's like the chef worrying about which particular stirring spoon they're using rather than actually worrying about the dish as a whole or that sort of thing. It is important, but ultimately at the time of shooting, you shouldn't be getting bogged down and getting distracted with it. One of the reasons that cameras have all these options of autofocus is that different subjects do benefit from different types of autofocus. And also, different photographers have their preferences in the way they like their autofocus to work. And the right autofocus for anyone out there is the one that works for you. So we'll tell you what we do, but if you're happy with the way you go about shooting, then that is the right way for you to go. If you're finding you're struggling with your autofocus, then maybe you want to adopt some of the philosophies that we're going to talk about. So it's not a case, you don't want to be reinventing things. So just to cover a couple of the big ones, one of those questions was AFC or AFS. AFC is a continuous servo autofocus where the camera continues to focus all the time that you're half pressing the shutter button. It'll keep focusing all the time. Single servo autofocus is the camera will focus once. Once it's got focus on the subject, it'll let you take a picture, and then it stays fixed until you've taken the picture. I would say in underwater photography, continuous servo, AFC, CAF, whatever you want to call it across the different cameras, is the way to go. Because underwater, you cannot stay still yourself unless you always lie on the seabed, and your subject is lying on the seabed. If you and the fish or whatever you're photographing are in the water column, you're not going to be staying still, and neither is the subject. And as a result, continuous focusing is the way to go. However, some cameras, and I'd say particularly some of the older mirrorless cameras and also some of the compact cameras, have very poor continuous autofocus, whereas they have very good single servo or AFS performance. So as a result, that advice may not apply to you. And then the other thing I wanted to cover as a general comment before I let Matt talk about his autofocusing is in terms of autofocus activation. Many underwater photographers like to use back button autofocus, where you find a lever on your housing that fits underneath your right thumb, and you set that to be your autofocus activation. And when you press the shutter button to take a picture, it doesn't activate any autofocus. And many photographers really like that decoupling of autofocus compared to shooting. You want to focus, press this button. I want to shoot, I press this button. And therefore, I can take a load of pictures without refocusing, or I can focus very carefully and then know the focus is right. And if you like that, that is a great way to shoot. Many really, really excellent photographers shoot that way. I personally don't see the reason why I need to press two buttons when I could just press one. So I generally have my autofocus set on the shutter release for most of the pictures I take. The only time I use back button focus is when I specifically don't want it on the shutter button because I know the camera might struggle. For example, if I'm shooting a split level picture and I want to focus on the underwater part and then not focus again, I'll do that. If I'm diving inside a dark wreck, a dark cave, I'm not going to be using lights. I know the camera might hunt a bit. I'll again use back button focus in that situation. And with older cameras, I would do a lot of super macro with back button focus. I have to say, with my Sony A1, it focuses so well on super macro that I actually just use autofocus now on the shutter release because it just seems to work. So why go to all that hassle of pressing this and rocking in and out when I can just focus and shoot? So that's sort of an opening splurge for you. And I'll let Matthew now talk a bit about what modes he likes to use. And I guess you're going to talk about Sony, aren't you?
So, I will. The first thing I want to say is I am one of those people who uses back button focus exclusively. It's one of the first things I set on any camera I use. At this point, it's largely probably muscle memory for me more than a necessity, but it's just how I've gotten used to shooting. So I don't plan on changing it anytime soon. In terms of autofocus modes, I actually, while I shoot Sony right now, my favorite all-time autofocus mode on any system is Nikon's 3D tracking. I think they knocked it out of the park with that. And from DSLR, which I don't remember when they introduced it, maybe like the D4S or something like that, up through the Z9 now, they all kind of have the same implementation of that 3D tracking system. And I like it for the simplicity of it and the way it works. It just works really, really well. So if for those who aren't familiar with it, you can kind of pick where in the 3D tracking is going to grab whatever your subject is. And then as long as you're holding down, and this is another reason I got used to back button focus, if you're holding down the back button focus, it's just going to keep tracking that thing everywhere in the frame. And obviously the older DSLRs were good at it. The newer cameras like the Z9, Z8 are remarkable at it. And then you can also add in like eye tracking on top of that, which works depending on the subject. But I think it's gotten to the point where some of these mirrorless cameras have too many autofocus modes, and it can almost be overwhelming in terms of what to use when or what you can layer on top of other autofocus modes. So currently, I don't have the patience for all of that. So I keep mine relatively simple. I use AFC all the time. I shoot the A1. I don't use AFS ever, unless maybe once in a while shooting something topside. But underwater, I always have AFC. And I just have it on, I usually use zone, which is like it doesn't do the whole screen. It does like the center or the center 2/3 of the screen. And then I leave it on, I think it's just zone and auto. So the A1 is reasonably good at finding whatever is the main thing in that box and focusing on it, and keeping it relatively locked in focus. Times it can get confused are if you're shooting, certain times with macro, it can get a little bit confused, especially if you're in darker environments where it won't necessarily pick up exactly what you want it to focus on. And in that case, I have one of my custom functions, which we talked about in a previous video, is set to be able to quickly toggle through the different autofocus modes. So in that case, I'll just go down. I think it's just one below on Sony's autofocus mode to it's like the single box or something like that. It's really small. And then you can move that around the screen, and just pick your precise spot to use to focus on. And it's still going to continuously. So as long as something's in that box and you hold down the back button, in my case, it'll continue to focus on that. So if you're moving in and out a little bit, it should stay with the subject. It just doesn't follow it all over the screen like one of the tracking or wide auto modes does. So for macro, I'll sometimes do that. For wide, I typically just leave it on zone and auto and kind of let it do its thing. And 99% of the time, those two modes work really well. I'm sure there are scenarios where if I layered tracking on top of something else, or I chose like the whole widescreen autofocus continuous, it would probably benefit me in some way. But to be honest, I just don't have the patience for that, and I'm used to what I'm used to at this point. And
I think
I've got
what
it
you
to work.
said about simply, these cameras have huge numbers of options, and
Yeah,
you've even got control over how much they hold on to the subject in tracking,
yeah,
and endless options, and ultimately autofocus is there to help you. And what you said in there, you keep it simple, don't overcomplicate things, is really valuable advice for people. I would say it's I think people feel that if they're not using every function of their camera, they're not getting the value out of it, and
yeah,
ultimately they get so caught up in all of this that they miss the photos. Autofocus is invented so that you can focus on other things, focus your brain on other things. And the autofocus, and if your autofocus is taking all your attention to attach this mode and do this mode and do this, you're missing the shots. You're not thinking about the light. You're not thinking about the composition.
yeah,
So yeah,
yeah.
I really agree with your simple first approach.
There's literally just two autofocus modes that I
Yeah.
use, and I don't pay attention to the rest of them. And if I shot Nikon, I'm less familiar with Canons. I know they have like one shot in servo and then a million different things in servo. But if I shot Nikon, I would probably just use 3D tracking 99% of the time. For Sony, we just went over that, and I think Canon has something. Canon's autofocus, at least the last time I used it, is relatively similar to Sony's. It's closer to Sony's than Nikon's, I think, in terms of like their
Yeah, you can
wide
usually
field
with all
tracking.
of them get back to about the same place. It's I
Yeah.
haven't shot it's 8 months since I last shot the Canon underwater, so I forget it all. But I was super impressed by the 5D Mark II's autofocus. It was absolutely fantastic, and I
R5
could
Mark II.
yeah R5s.
Yeah, 5D Mark II had pretty poor
5D Mark II
autofocus.
autofocus not so good, better than the 5Ds, but yeah, pretty awful compared to everything else. No, but yeah, I was really impressed by the R5 Mark II. It was very very impressive. My approach is fairly similar in that I have my favorite few modes on the Sony. So when I shoot wide angle, I use the wide area autofocus almost all the time. I find that the wide area, it just means that whatever in the frame the front of my subject is, it'll be in focus. So if my shark crosses the whole frame, I've got coverage on the edges, so it'll stay focused on the front of it. And within that wide area, what wide area is doing is it's turning on all the whole autofocus sensor, and it's basically very good at picking out what the obvious subject is, and then it will focus on the front end of that subject, and therefore you'll get the rest of it in focus as well. So I use the wide area. If it's struggling, I'll go to zone like you do. And zone basically works the same way, but instead of having the whole sensor on, you can turn on a zone of it in Sony speak and move that around. In Nikon speak, the wide area is called auto area. It's the whole sensor is on. It's not the number of points on, it's the whole sensor is on. And again, that'll pick up the foreground subject. It's a nice, easy way to shoot. When it comes to macro shooting, I like to use a single point of autofocus, but I use a single point but in tracking mode on the Sony. And that's exactly the same as 3D tracking on the Nikon. So it
Yeah.
works the same way. It's a single point, but it's dynamic. I'll generally use the single point small. So small tracking point around the medium, sometimes and the large are a bit big sometimes for subjects, particularly if you really want to nail the eye of a little fish or the ridges on a rhinophore of a nudibranch. It's good to have that small point that you can position on them. And with the tracking, you've obviously got that ability that it will follow the subject around. But actually, the way underwater photographers tend to use it more is you tend to focus on the subject, get it in focus, and then actually just recompose your picture slightly, and the tracking will follow that eye. So you start with the eye in the middle, you
Yeah.
recompose so the eye's not, and then the tracking will move across the frame. And 3D tracking on Nikon Speak does that. The dynamic, I can't remember the name of it, in Canon does the same, and tracking autofocus on the Sony does. I tend to, on tracking autofocus, either use spot within tracking, small area, or I'll use expand spot, which is
Mm.
it just
Yeah.
it
Yeah.
gives it a bit of flexibility just to expand a little bit. Now, if I'm shooting with macro really static subjects, I'll actually turn tracking off and go to just a single point. You know, if the whole dive is basically, it's a nudibranch dive and they're not fast moving nudies. Sometimes in cold water, you know, they're not going to do anything. And on that sort of dive where I don't want my camera making any decisions for me in a difficult focusing situation, I'll sometimes turn tracking off. But I'd say that's very rare, but maybe 5 to 10% of the time. Again, with super macro, if I really want to nail the focus on the edge of an eye of, you know, a tiny little blenny or something sticking out of a rock, I'll turn tracking off and just go to single point autofocus on the smallest size and stick it on the subject. The other focus option I'll have on my camera is subject recognition. Now, no underwater camera, none of the mirrorless cameras that can do subject recognition. No one's programmed a camera yet with underwater subjects. So you're trying to use their general animal slash bird slash insect, whatever you've got options for. But generic animal is usually the best, or animal slash bird is better than, you know, so you give it as wide a range of animals as possible is your best bet for underwater subjects. And in those modes, the camera will, if the subject is small in the frame, it'll pick the whole subject. But typically we're using those modes when the subject is big in the frame, and then it's really looking for eyes. And those modes do work in underwater photography. They work better with the newer cameras. So the camera we shoot at the moment is Sony A1. I think cameras have moved on a step or two since that camera in terms of subject recognition. I would say about half the time in macro shooting, the subject recognition is useful to have on the Sony A1. Whereas I would say on the R5 Mark II, it picks the subjects just all the time for you. And the newer, you've shot the A9 III as well.
Yeah. The A9 III is the same way, where like there's a noticeable difference in terms of how quickly it can figure out exactly where, so same thing. I left it in the A9 III, I left an animal. They might have just a dedicated animal one, not animal bird.
Yeah.
So I put an animal, and I vividly remember the first time taking it on a dive, and it stuck to a seahorse eye, and it never let it go the entire time, and it picked it up like that. So I think a lot of those newer cameras will start to implement things like that could be more useful, and then makes your life easier, so you can focus on things like composition and lighting instead of worrying about trying to move a focus point around or something like that.
And that's exactly the right attitude. Yeah.
And it was almost too smart. So I think they're clearly, these cameras are made for topside things where I think they're amazing. I shot the A9 III on my dog who has dark eyes in dark spots, and
a Dalmatian.
Yes. And it stuck her to her eye flawlessly every time I photographed her. I think underwater, because like you said, nobody's made an underwater subject mode. So they're still trying to figure that out. So I think it can be a bit too smart at sometimes. It'll stick to like a random spot on an animal or something like that. But for the vast majority of the time, it would pick up the eye and stick to it properly.
Yeah, the things mine struggles with is if I'm shooting a moray eel and the eyes are on the side here, it always goes for the nostrils.
Yeah.
And then butterfly fish, it will go for the false eye, which is kind of shows that their evolution is working, at least in terms of a defense. It can fool the camera. So if you are going to use subject recognition underwater, it's the final bit of advice I've got is make sure that's easy to turn on and off. And
Yeah.
I have it set up on my camera. So one of the levers on the back of the camera is it's the record button because I don't shoot video. I've got that programmed to be subject detection on and off. So if I'm shooting something and the subject detection is jumping off the subject because it thinks it's trying to help me but actually isn't, I can turn it straight off. And then I've just got back to a nice simple system. But I think the most important things we said in this, rather than the specific advice around the cameras, and I would just say, to backtrack into the olden days when I shot with Nikon SLRs, I would use AFC. I'd use the auto area for wide angle, just the whole sensor on, and the camera was very clever. And then for macro, I generally use 3D tracking the same way I use tracking spot now on the Sony. I think the key things though we've said though is remember that autofocus is there to help you. It's not about using every possible mode of your camera, every possible setting is being customized by you, and therefore you'll suddenly become a better photographer. The more thought you're putting into autofocus, the less thought you're putting into other things. And that's not a good thing. You want autofocus to be nice and easy. It's a helping hand to allow you to take better underwater photos. And the simpler you make it, the more likelihood you are to think about your lighting, think about your composition, and end up with a better shot than be constantly going, oh, well, you've got to have it exactly like this because it's marginally better. Yes, but you were so busy doing that maybe you missed the shot. So, yeah. Keep it simple. Get the shots. It's there to help. And if it works, the modes you're using are completely different to us. Please put them in the comments below. Share them with other users. But don't feel it's not a type of photography where there's a right or wrong. The reason the camera companies give us all these options is because the subjects are different. The way people shoot are different. Photographers have different preferences. And the ones that work for you, they are the correct choices, even if you don't know another underwater photographer who uses them.
Yep.
So, it's all about the images. Well, thank you, though, for watching us. That's a good place to wrap up this episode. And we're back again soon with another episode of the Underwater Photography Show.